So I was headed to the bike park here in Innsbruck to do some more testing on the brakes I've built a couple of weeks ago. And on this beautiful Saturday, all I could hear was this.
Oh my god, can you hear that? Wow, that's annoying.
My crown steerer unit recently started creaking. Again. I do wonder why that is.
That's not the line. Well, at least I cleared it.
Now you might think RockShox truly enjoys making a fork that sounds like two skeletons fucking a tin roof. But unfortunately, this is kind of inevitable with single crown forks. If you ride them hard enough, they'll start to creak sooner or later. The reason for this is what's called fretting corrosion. Tiny relative movements at the press fit interfaces that cause wear and disrupt the native oxide layer of the aluminum. The exposed fresh material then reacts with moisture and oxygen, forming more aluminum oxide particles that accumulate at the contact points and make creaking noises from stick-slip motions. And yes, I'm sure it's the CSU and not the headset, because when I swap in my old 27.5-inch fork, there's absolutely no creaking. But despite the annoying sounds and the occasional surprise mud hole, I still had a blast. Well, until this happened.
Uh-oh. Not great.
I went online looking for a replacement fork and came across a deal I couldn't refuse. Now, I hate to be the guy treating his fork as a throwaway part, especially since, apart from the tiny bit of corrosion between the crown and the stanchions, there's nothing wrong with it. Actually, I have the luxury of living across the street from one of the few shops in Europe equipped to repair CSU creaking. But the truth is, there will be no guarantee that the fork wouldn't start creaking again. Anyway, now that I'm stuck doing repairs on my bike and have to take the fork apart, I figured this was the perfect opportunity to take a deep dive in how air springs work. This video also serves to publish my air spring design, so fair warning, it might get a bit technical. To make sure we're all on the same page, let's first look at what an air spring actually does. At its core, a spring is a position-sensitive device. It pushes back with a force that depends on how far it's compressed. In the case of an air spring, the force comes from air molecules colliding with a movable piston. In other words, the pressure acts over the piston area and produces a force. In most mountain bike forks, the air spring consists of two chambers on either side of the piston. The chamber that gets smaller during compression is the positive chamber, while the one that gets bigger is the negative chamber. Together, these create a characteristic spring curve, where the fork travel is plotted versus the generated spring force. The main advantage of air springs is that they're simple to adjust. You just change the internal pressure with a pump to suit different rider weights. Since the negative chamber sits on the same side as the piston rod, its effective piston area is a little smaller. That means the pressure in this chamber will need to be a bit higher to balance the piston forces at the beginning of the stroke. If the positive pressure is too high, it will cause the fork to top out, which means you have to build up a certain force before it can start to move. If the negative pressure is too high, the fork gets sucked into its travel and loses part of its usable stroke. There's also the effects of the lower legs, which is very important to consider as well. The lowers act as two additional positive chambers and add significant ramp-up near the end of the stroke. You can additionally increase this end stroke progression by shrinking the positive chamber volume using volume-reducing tokens. Less volume will mean a sudden increase in bottom-out force. On the contrary, Increasing the volume of the negative chamber will have an effect on both the beginning and the end of the stroke. This little hump in spring force at the start of the curve can generally be reduced by increasing the volume of the negative chamber, but when adjusted to the same sag point, the fork will get more progressive with a larger negative chamber. This is the kind of stuff most riders are familiar with, but to truly understand what's going on, we need to zoom in, all the way down to the molecular level. Gas consists of small, free-moving molecules, each with their own velocity. From the mass of the molecule and its velocity, we can assign a certain amount of kinetic, that is, moving energy to it. However, not all molecules have the same velocity. The spread follows the Boltzmann distribution, which dictates a greater variance in molecular speeds at higher temperatures. Temperature, in this context, is just the average kinetic energy of all molecules, and thus their average speeds. Inside the spring, these molecules bounce off the cylinder walls and the piston. Each collision creates a tiny force on the wall, and on a macroscopic scale, all the small impacts from the molecules statistically add up to create a constant force over a certain area. In other words, pressure. You can increase the frequency of these collisions by adding more molecules to the chamber, or by increasing their speeds, and thus raising temperature. Alternatively, if you reduce the volume, you're giving the same number of molecules less space to move around in, so they also collide with the walls at a higher rate. Now we factor in the gas constant R, and voila, we get the ideal gas law. Naturally, gas molecules move in a random, chaotic way. But when you push the piston in, you force the molecules to move in an ordered fashion, in the same general direction. In a thermodynamic sense, this is called doing work, bringing the system out of its natural chaotic state and putting energy into it. On the kinetic level, when the fork compresses, the inward moving piston transfers its momentum to the molecules it collides with. That means quintillions of gas molecules get a tiny speed boost every millisecond. The faster molecules then collide with others, spreading the energy throughout the gas and increasing the temperature. If the system immediately transfers that heat energy to the environment, the temperature would stay constant and only the ambient air would warm up slightly. This is what is referred to as an isothermal compression. Since no molecules escape the cylinder and the temperature doesn't change, nRT stays constant, and therefore, PV is constant. From this, we can calculate the isothermal spring curve. But what happens when no heat can escape to the environment? In that case, every time a molecule collides with the piston, it increases the system's temperature just a little. Every piston collision adds energy. More energy means faster molecules. Faster molecules mean more piston collisions, and the system heats up even more. This creates a positive feedback loop. The hotter it gets, the faster it heats. This process adds an extra layer of progression due to rising temperatures. It is called an adiabatic or sometimes isentropic compression, a word that I'm sure everyone has in their vocabulary. In this case, P times V by the power of gamma is constant, and we end up with a steeper spring curve, the adiabatic one. So, to summarize, during isothermal compression, pressure increases only due to volume reduction, while during adiabatic compression, pressure increases due to both volume reduction and rising temperature. In the real world, there's always some amount of heat transfer. During slow compressions, the system has enough time to offload nearly all the heat into the fork's structure or surroundings, and the process is close to isothermal. But during fast hits, there's not enough time to dump the heat, and the gas behaves more adiabatically. To quantify this effect and look at realistic spring curves, we need to introduce a few physical assumptions. According to the first law of thermodynamics, the change in internal energy of the system equals to the work done on it plus the heat exchange. In an ideal isothermal case, all the work done is immediately lost as heat, so the internal energy doesn't change. That also means we can calculate the heat flow as the negative of the work done, as the sum of these two equals 0. Since this scenario gives us the maximum possible heat loss, we can treat it as an upper bound. In reality, the system will lose less heat than in the isothermal case, and more than in the adiabatic case, where no heat escapes at all. So the real internal energy increase will also fall between these two extremes. To simulate this, we model the compression as a sequence of small time steps, assuming a constant shaft velocity. In each step, We calculate how much work is done and how much heat is lost using Newton's law of cooling. Since the thermal exchange between the different chambers and the outside world gets complex fast, we simplify the model. All chambers transfer heat to the environment, except for the negative chamber and the spring side lower leg, which are assumed to be in thermal balance with their surroundings. The effective contact area for heat transfer also changes with fork travel, something we have to factor in. At each step, we calculate the change in real internal energy by subtracting the estimated heat loss from the theoretical adiabatic energy gain. That gives us a corrected temperature, from which we compute pressure and force. This lets us simulate a real spring curve for any given shaft velocity. Common shaft speeds vary from about 10 mm per second in very slow compressions to 1000 mm per second in hard hits. Super fast impacts can reach up to 8 meters per second. But at 1000 mm per second, the compression already exhibits mostly adiabatic character. At this velocity, a 170 mm travel fork would get compressed in only 170 milliseconds, so just about in the blink of an eye. This means air springs get significantly more progressive at higher speeds, which can lead to a harsh ramp-up and may even prevent riders from using full travel. On top of that, the simulation here assumes a single compression stroke, but during repeated hits, the air heats up even more due to cumulative energy input and friction, making the spring curve stiffer over time. That's a key reason why air springs are harder to control than coil springs, which are purely position sensitive. Air springs, by contrast, depend on position, velocity, and temperature. Several attempts to modify the spring curve have been made over the past years, which include the use of a free-chamber system, which introduces an extra air chamber that remains in equilibrium with the air spring to smooth out progression and create a more gradual ramp-up. There are also two-stage air springs, which use a separate chamber that connects or disconnects at a certain point in the travel to produce a similar result, but making its effect discontinuous. Then there's the insert from Trutune, an activated carbon adsorbent that regulates ramp-up and reduces speed sensitivity through adsorption and heat exchange. The challenge there is long-term durability. The adsorbent surface can be poisoned by trace gases like water vapor, carbon dioxide, or volatile organic compounds, and a filter can clog up, thus reducing its effectiveness. Lastly, Formula introduced closed-cell foam volume spacers. These are basically made up of millions of tiny air chambers in the form of cells and function similarly to a three-chamber system. They reduce ramp-up steepness, but at the same time have a damping effect during rebound, thanks to slowed deformation, which also helps to reduce speed sensitivity. I started experimenting with increasing the volume of the negative chamber to improve mid-stroke support, but my fork quickly became too progressive. My first idea was to enlarge the positive chamber by relocating most of the negative chamber volume to the outside of the fork. That's actually super easy to do, since many modern air springs use the hollow piston shaft as an extension of the negative chamber. By drilling a hole in the lock nut, I could connect an external reservoir directly to the internal negative chamber. I then added a Trutune insert, but the effect wasn't enough to counter the extra progression introduced by the large negative chamber. To recap, this added progression comes from the pressure in the negative chamber dropping too quickly on one side, while the pressure in the spring side lower leg increases too quickly on the other side of the seal head. That creates an imbalance, and the result is a steep rise in force late in the stroke. The solution was to convert the air spring seal head into an internal floating piston, or IFP, and allowing it to move upward under large compressions. At the beginning of the stroke, the pressure in the negative chamber exceeds the ambient pressure inside the lower leg. That preload keeps the IFP fixed in place. But as the fork compresses, the pressure in the negative chamber drops, while the pressure in the lower leg increases. At some point, both sides reach an equilibrium, and from that point on, the IFP begins to move. It continues to move for the rest of the stroke, keeping the pressure on both sides roughly constant. To determine when the transition happens, we introduce a new variable Z, which represents IFP travel. It shows when and how far the IFP moves during the compression stroke. I designed the system to deviate from the original spring curve, just as the progressive ramp-up typically begins. The beauty of this approach is that it disproportionately affects fast compressions, which means the system self-regulates to reduce the speed sensitivity of the air spring. As far as I know, this creates the most linear spring curve ever implemented on a mountain bike fork. And if additional progression is still desired, volume tokens can be added just as usual. It's not reinventing the wheel, just an attempt to balance all the relevant factors and build a spring that behaves more in line with what I want from my suspension system. Now with all that rambling done, it's time to finally build this fork back together.
Oh, cock.
And with that, it's back to the creaky fork.
Oh, what the hell? Oh, that's new. Oop. Oh, come on. Ah, why do they have to destroy everything?